So welcome to our second lecture on economic policy. This time around, we're going to be delving into the federal budget. Specifically, we're going to be talking about revenues and outlays. Outlays is just another word for expenditures here. We're also going to cover tax projections, outlay projections, and deficit projections over the next 10 years. Almost all of the figures you're about to see come from the CBO, which is the Congressional Budget Office, or the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So first, let's talk about revenues and outlays. Revenues are the money that the federal government receives. These tend to be from sources like payroll taxes, income taxes, corporate taxes, estate taxes, and other taxes like customs duties and tariffs. Outlays, on the other hand, are the money that the federal government spends. These tend to fall along a few categories, like mandatory expenditures, which are expenditures that Congress legislates outside of the annual appropriations process. And much of mandatory spending is determined by eligibility rules, like whether someone qualifies or not for Social Security, as opposed to Congress deciding to increase or decrease spending. The primary mandatory spending categories are Medicare and Social Security spending. We'll talk about that in a little bit. In contrast, discretionary spending is the portion of the budget that is decided each year by Congress through the annual appropriations process. The largest spending category for discretionary expenditures is the military. And finally, there are interest payments, which represents about 10% of our total expenditures or outlays every year, net interest payments, I should say here. And this is just the interest we pay each year on our accumulated debt. So what we can see here is the outlay, which is the blue line, and revenue projections as a percentage of GDP. So revenue is down here in the green, and outlays or expenditures are up here in the blue from 1970 to 2030. So we're projecting through 2030. Keep in mind that these projections were done in January 2020 before COVID. So this financial picture is likely to be a bit worse than what we see here. But what we can see is that both revenue down here in the green and outlays are projected to grow faster than GDP over the next 10 years. And the growth in outlays or expenditures is going to be greater than the growth in revenues. In other words, the federal government is going to be spending more money than we are receiving. Now, you might be wondering, where does most of our revenue come from? Now, more than half comes from individual income taxes, which is right here at this blue line on top, followed closely by social insurance taxes, which is the yellow one here, which is typically a payroll tax that you pay every time you get a paycheck. It goes to Social Security and Medicare. About 5%, at least at this point, comes from a corporate income tax, and a little less than 5 comes from the excise tax, which is down here in like a gray. You can see, though, that this composition has changed over time. This is from 1934 to 2018. Corporate taxes used to be much higher, this red line, red-orange, I suppose, mid-century, and social insurance, this yellow line, and individual income taxes used to be much lower in the 40s. Really, individual income taxes, though, have remained relatively stable as a proportion of revenue, while corporate tax rates have pretty much fallen. Corporate income taxes have fallen, okay? So total revenues as a share of GDP, though, are expected to rise by 2030, largely because of increasing receipts from individual income taxes. So you'll note that nothing else is increasing from 2020 to 2030. Only individual income taxes. This is because many of the individual income tax cuts from that 2017 tax bill will expire in 2025. You see how right in 2025 it bumps back up again, which is why you see the increase starting there. Keep in mind, though, again, that these projections were made before COVID hit. So again, they might be a little bit different now. Now, what will our spending look like in the future based on these January 2020 CBO predictions? We expect that outlays or expenditures will generally increase by 2030, and most of these increases in projected outlays stem from growth in mandatory spending, which you can see right here, and interest payments right here. Now let's delve a bit more into this increase in mandatory spending and interest spending over the next decade. What is driving that? Really, the type of mandatory spending they expect to increase over the next decade is Social Security and Medicare, right? Here's Social Security, here is Medicare. Both programs for the elderly. The aging of the population and generally the rising healthcare costs will increase our outlays for this population over the next decade, as you can see with Social Security and healthcare programs. Moreover, our net interest down here costs, those are going to rise over the next decade as well as we accumulate more debt. Ultimately, the debt projections made in January 2020 were quite pessimistic. So these are debt projections that we made in January 2020. And here we can see how debt held by the public as a percentage of GDP is projected to grow by the end of 2030. It doesn't look good. High and rising federal debt would reduce national savings and income. It's going to boost interest payments, and ultimately it's going to limit policymakers' responses to unforeseen events like COVID, and just ultimately put us in a relatively poor position financially. But this projection doesn't even take into account COVID. So this was a CBO projection done this summer of our deficit. And you can see that as a percentage of GDP right here. So this is deficit as a percent of GDP. We really dipped down in 2010, 2009 during the recession. And it starts getting closer back up to zero, which is a good thing. But then it has sort of declined since 2015. And you can see that the deficit as a percent of GDP is currently around like -4%. And through this year, it's probably going to be something like -20%. So really our debt and deficit projections are likely going to be a bit worse by 2030. So for this lecture, we covered revenue and outlays, tax projections, outlay projections, and deficit projections for the next 10 years. And most of these figures come from the CBO. Now, for discussion section, we're going to be discussing market failures, patterns of spending and taxation, and the financial outlook for the federal government for the next decade. And we're also going to be discussing economic theories and their applications, but I will see you all in your discussion sections.